Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Kentucky. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the remote hills of Harlan County, Kentucky, there exists a peculiar gap in the historical record, a deliberate absence that speaks louder than any official documentation. Between 1902 and 1906, a family named Ashton resided on property near Cumberland Gap, yet no birth records, property deeds, or census documents acknowledge their presence. The county courthouse fire of 1908 destroyed numerous documents, providing convenient cover for what was actually a systematic erasure of the Ashton name from public memory. Testimony from elderly residents interviewed in the 1,960 seconds confirms that this deletion went far beyond fire damage. Newspaper archives from neighboring counties contain references to the Ashtons that have been physically cut from preserved copies in Harlan County libraries, leaving rectangular holes where articles once existed. The family's existence can only be proven through fragments, letters sent to relatives in other states, personal diaries never submitted to official collections, and the whispered memories of those old enough to remember when speaking the name Ashton was forbidden. What happened on that isolated property near Cumberland Gap was deemed so disturbing, so damaging to the community's reputation and economic prospects, that local authorities decided the family had never existed at all. This is not a story of forgotten history, but of deliberately erased history, a conspiracy of silence maintained across generations. The truth, however, has a way of resisting burial. Like bone, it endures beneath the surface, waiting for those willing to dig. Harlan County in 1902 was a landscape of recovery and transformation. The Civil War had ended nearly 4 decades earlier, but its scars remained visible in the rugged Kentucky mountains. The coal mining boom was beginning to reshape the region's economy, drawing outsiders to communities that had long been isolated and insular. Roads were primitive, little more than dirt paths, carved through dense forests of oak and pine. Mountain hollows harbored families who measured their privacy in miles rather than yards, where a man's business was his own, and questions were considered impolite at best, dangerous at worst. Into this setting, in late autumn 1902, came the Ashton family. According to recovered letters from the Henderson family, neighbors who lived closest to the Ashtons before relocating to Virginia in 1904, Dr. Cornelius Ashton arrived with his wife Margaret and 4 children. Nathaniel, age 16, Elizabeth, 14, Catherine, 11, and young Samuel, only 7 years old. The family purchased approximately 65 acres of heavily wooded property 3 miles outside the settlement of Harlan, land that offered seclusion and required substantial clearing. Dr. Ashton presented himself as a physician from Lexington, seeking a quieter practice away from urban pressures. The family appeared refined, well-dressed, and educated, a marked contrast to most settlers in the area. Their belongings, transported in multiple wagons, suggested considerable wealth. Neighbors noted the family's unusual reserve, their reluctance to engage in the social customs that typically bound frontier communities together. Dr. Ashton was courteous but distant, his wife even more withdrawn. The children were rarely seen and never heard. Within weeks of their arrival, construction began on not just a substantial home, but an enormous barn that would exceed the house in size, built with attention to detail that puzzled local workers hired to assist. Dr. Cornelius Ashton wasted little time establishing his medical practice in Harlan County. He set up a small clinic attached to the family home, and initially gained a reputation for competent treatment of injuries common to mining and farming communities. Personal diaries of former patients, discovered decades later, document his thoroughness and skill in setting broken bones, treating infections, and managing chronic conditions. However, these same accounts note peculiarities in his approach that grew more pronounced through the winter of 1902 and into 1903. Dr. Ashton displayed an unusual fascination with family medical histories, questioning patients extensively about hereditary conditions, congenital abnormalities, and any relatives who had been born with physical irregularities. His questions went beyond normal diagnostic inquiry, probing into matters that seemed irrelevant to the immediate ailment being treated. Store ledgers from Harlan's General Mercantile, discovered in a private collection in 1958, revealed Dr. Ashton's extraordinary purchasing patterns. He bought massive quantities of formaldehyde, far more than any legitimate practice would require. His orders included specialized surgical instruments, dozens of glass specimen jars of various sizes, embalming supplies, and chemicals used in preservation. When the store owner, Henry Whitfield, expressed curiosity about these unusual requisitions, Dr. Ashton explained he was conducting anatomical research to improve his understanding of mountain ailments. He spoke of documenting the physical characteristics unique to Appalachian populations, a study he claimed would advance medical science. Whitfield found the explanation plausible enough, though privately he noted in his personal journal that the quantities seemed excessive. The doctor paid in cash, always promptly, and his money was as good as anyone's. In the isolated communities of early 20th century Kentucky, a man's business was his own, particularly if that man was educated, well-spoken, and free with his spending. The Henderson family's correspondence provides the most detailed contemporary account of the Ashton household. Martha Henderson and her sister in Roanoke, Virginia, maintained regular communication, letters that survived because they were preserved outside Harlan County. Martha's observations grew increasingly troubled through 1903 and into 1904. She noted that the Ashton children never attended the local school, despite laws requiring education for children their ages. When Martha inquired about this during a chance meeting in town, Dr. Ashton explained he was educating them privately, claiming the local school's curriculum was inadequate for children of their intellectual capacity. Martha found this explanation unsettling rather than reassuring. She described the children, particularly the eldest son, Nathaniel, as having a peculiar stillness about them, as if watching and waiting always. They moved with odd precision, spoke only when directly addressed, and never displayed the normal energy or curiosity of young people. Most disturbing to Martha were the nocturnal activities at the Ashton property. The Henderson farm lay close enough that sounds carried across the hollow on still nights. Martha wrote to her sister about lamps burning in the barn until nearly dawn, visible through gaps in the covered windows. The sounds that drifted through the darkness were not those of ordinary farming or even of a medical practice. She described the clink of metal instruments, the scrape of something heavy being moved, and occasionally, though she hesitated to commit this to paper, sounds that resembled sawing. When Martha's husband mentioned these observations to other men in town, suggesting perhaps the doctor was conducting some late-night veterinary work, he was met with uncomfortable silence. People changed the subject quickly. Already, less than a year after the Ashtons' arrival, neighbors had learned not to ask too many questions. In the spring of 1903, a drifter named Jacob Turner arrived in Harlan seeking mining work. Turner was 28 years old, from Tennessee, with no close family and few connections. He found employment at one of the smaller mining operations and was described by fellow workers as competent but quiet, a man who kept to himself. In April, Turner suffered a severe leg injury when a support timber collapsed during a mine cave-in. He was carried to Dr. Ashton's clinic, where the doctor set the fractured bone and provided ongoing care. According to testimony from miners recorded by a traveling journalist in 1904, Turner mentioned he would be staying at the Ashton property during his convalescence, as he had no other lodging, and Dr. Ashton had offered him a room in exchange for light work once he recovered. This arrangement was not unusual for the time. Turner was last seen in early May 1903, walking toward the Ashton homestead on crutches. When his brother arrived from Tennessee in June, searching for Jacob after letters went unanswered, Dr. Ashton explained that Turner had recovered sufficiently to continue his travels northward, seeking mining opportunities in West Virginia. The doctor seemed genuinely puzzled by the brother's concern, stating that Turner had left nearly 3 weeks earlier and had given no indication he intended to contact family before departing. Without evidence of foul play and faced with Dr. Ashton's confident explanation, Turner's brother filed a missing person report with the county sheriff before returning to Tennessee. That report has vanished from official records. Jacob Turner became the first name in what would become a growing list of individuals last seen in the vicinity of the Ashton property who were never heard from again. At the time, his disappearance raised questions but no alarm. Drifters were common, their movements unpredictable, their absences rarely noted beyond immediate acquaintances. The Ashton children remained enigmatic figures, glimpsed occasionally but never truly seen. Elizabeth and Catherine sometimes accompanied their mother to town, walking several paces behind her in identical dark dresses, their hair pulled back severely from pale faces. They never spoke to other young people, never showed interest in the shops or goods on display. A schoolteacher's journal, discovered in a trunk sale in 1971, provides one of the few direct observations. The teacher described encountering Elizabeth in the general store. The girl stood motionless while her mother shopped, her eyes following every movement but never meeting another person's gaze directly. When the teacher inquired if Elizabeth might like to join the school, explaining that they had several girls her age, Margaret Ashton answered for her daughter. She explained that Elizabeth had a delicate constitution that required careful management, that the walk to school would be too taxing, that the girl's education was proceeding adequately under her father's instruction. The teacher noted there was nothing delicate about Elizabeth's physical appearance. Rather, there was something rigid and unnatural in her posture, as if she had been trained to stand precisely so, and dared not deviate from that training. The youngest child, Samuel, was rarely seen after the first year of the family's residence. Neighbors speculated he was sickly, perhaps consumptive, kept indoors for his health. The few who glimpsed him noted he had an odd way of moving, slow and deliberate, as if each motion required conscious thought. When Nathaniel appeared in town on errands, usually to collect supplies his father had ordered, people found excuses to avoid conversation. There was something about the boy that disturbed even hardened mountain folk. His eyes held no warmth, no curiosity, nothing that suggested a 16-year-old's normal interest in the world. He performed his tasks with mechanical efficiency and returned home without lingering. The Ashton property, according to a survey map discovered in Tennessee State Archives decades later, consisted of the main house and an unusually large barn set approximately 100 yards behind it. The house was substantial, a 2-story timber frame structure with multiple rooms and glass windows, luxuries in that time and place, but the barn exceeded it in size and clearly received more attention during construction. It was built with unusual features for an agricultural building. Thick walls, suggesting heavy insulation, a complex ventilation system with pipes extending through the roof, and windows that were covered from within, so no light escaped, though neighbors knew lamps burned inside most nights. The Henderson letters describe Martha's growing fascination with this structure. From her property, she could see the barn's outline against the sky, and noticed that someone was always moving around it, even during hours when farm work would normally cease. A traveling tinker named Ezra Walsh called on the Ashton property in autumn 1903, hoping to sell household wares or offer repair services. Years later, Walsh told others he had glimpsed through an uncovered window while approaching the barn. He described seeing rows of tables with something laid upon them covered with white sheets, and Dr. Ashton moving among them with instruments in hand, making notations in a ledger. Walsh had called out a greeting, startling the doctor, who emerged from the barn with unusual haste and a forced smile. Dr. Ashton purchased several items Walsh was selling, far more than needed, and paid generously. As Walsh prepared to leave, the doctor mentioned that his research required privacy and concentration. He suggested that discussion of what Walsh might have glimpsed could harm important scientific work. The payment Walsh received exceeded the value of his goods by a substantial margin. The message was clear: discretion would be rewarded, indiscretion would not be tolerated. As winter settled over Harlan County in late 1903, 3 more individuals disappeared after contact with the Ashton household. In November, Sarah Combs, a 19-year-old woman from a large local family, accepted a position as housemaid with the Ashtons. The family needed help with domestic tasks, and Sarah needed employment. She departed for the Ashton property with her few belongings, promising to return home on Sundays. She never came back. When her parents inquired after their daughter the following week, Dr. Ashton expressed regret and disappointment, explaining that Sarah had stolen several valuable items from the household and fled during the night. He showed them a list of missing articles: silver candlesticks, a cash box, jewelry belonging to Mrs. Ashton. The Combs family found this accusation difficult to believe, as Sarah had never shown dishonest tendencies, but they had no evidence to contradict the doctor's account. In January 1904, Thomas Reed, a 34-year-old widower with no close family, was hired by Dr. Ashton for heavy work on the property. Reed had mentioned to acquaintances he would be helping with construction projects and land clearing. After 2 weeks, Reed's few friends in town noticed his absence. Dr. Ashton explained that Reed had accepted better-paying work at a mine in Virginia and left without notice. Finally, in February, Michael O'Brien, a 23-year-old Irish immigrant working in the mines, told fellow workers that Dr. Ashton had offered him payment for participating in a medical study. O'Brien needed money to bring his sister from Ireland and was willing to do whatever necessary. He was seen walking toward the Ashton property one Saturday afternoon. When questioned weeks later about O'Brien's whereabouts, Dr. Ashton stated the young man had completed the study, received his payment, and mentioned traveling to Cincinnati, where work was more plentiful. In each case, the explanations were plausible. The missing individuals had few ties to investigate their disappearances, and authorities saw no grounds for official inquiry. Through the spring of 1904, multiple accounts document a dramatic change in Margaret Ashton's appearance and behavior. A shopkeeper's diary describes her as transformed, pale as death itself, with eyes that seemed to look past this world into another. She had always been reserved, but now she appeared haunted, jumping at sudden sounds, glancing over her shoulder as if pursued. Her purchases became increasingly unusual. She bought large quantities of patent medicines containing laudanum, several bottles of whiskey, which was highly inappropriate for a respectable woman of her station, and oddly, children's toys, despite her youngest child being nearly 9 years old. When the shopkeeper inquired if she was buying gifts for grandchildren, or perhaps to donate to charity, Margaret stared at him without comprehension, before turning away without answering. The most disturbing account comes from Martha Henderson's final letter before her family's departure from Harlan County in May 1904. Martha described encountering Margaret Ashton on the road between their properties. Margaret stopped her, gripping Martha's arm with surprising strength for someone who appeared so frail. Her words came in a rushed whisper. "Keep your children close. Don't let them wander near our property. There are things in this world that science should not touch, but my husband cannot stop touching them." Before Martha could respond or ask questions, Margaret released her arm and hurried away, glancing back toward her own home, as if terrified of being seen speaking to a neighbor. Martha noted that Margaret's hands were shaking violently, and tears ran down her face, though she made no sound of crying. This encounter, more than any other single event, convinced the Henderson family that something profoundly wrong was occurring at the Ashton property. The question was, what to do about it? The Henderson family's decision to leave Harlan County came swiftly in May 1904, prompted by an incident involving their youngest son, Timothy, who was 8 years old. The boy disappeared for several hours one afternoon, causing his parents increasing panic as darkness approached. He was finally found wandering near the boundary of the Ashton property, in a state of shock, unable or unwilling to speak. When he finally recovered enough to communicate, his words tumbled out in a terrified rush. He described investigating strange sounds and discovering a gap in the barn wall where boards had warped. Through this gap, he glimpsed what he called the meat room. His description haunted his parents for the rest of their lives. Tables with people sleeping on them, but they weren't sleeping because they had no skin on their faces, and the doctor was writing in a book about their insides. The child insisted he saw instruments hanging on walls, jars filled with things he couldn't identify, and most horrifying, one of the figures on the tables had moved slightly, as if still alive, despite the absence of facial features. Timothy's parents initially tried to convince themselves the boy had witnessed animal butchering or some medical procedure taken out of context by a frightened child's imagination, but his details were too specific, too consistent, too disturbing to dismiss. That evening, they discussed reporting what their son had seen to the county sheriff, but before they could act, they received visitors. Dr. Ashton and his eldest son Nathaniel arrived after dark, a highly unusual social call. According to the account written years later by Henderson, the visit was cordial on the surface but threatening beneath. Dr. Ashton expressed concern that young Timothy had been trespassing on his property and might have seen things he could not properly understand. He explained his research in vague terms, speaking of advancing medical knowledge and the necessity of privacy in scientific work. Then he made an offer, a substantial sum of money in exchange for the Henderson family's immediate relocation. He suggested Virginia offered better opportunities, that Harlan County's isolation was unhealthy for growing children. The money would ensure a comfortable start in their new location. Nathaniel stood silently beside his father throughout this conversation, his presence more intimidating than any spoken threat. The summer of 1904 brought an oppressive quiet to the area surrounding the Ashton property. With the Henderson family gone and few other residents within several miles, the isolation that Dr. Ashton clearly desired was now complete. The family's visits to town became increasingly rare. Dr. Ashton's medical practice, which had never been extensive, dwindled to almost nothing as residents found reasons to seek care in neighboring communities or simply to endure their ailments without professional treatment. An unspoken understanding had developed that consulting Dr. Ashton was somehow dangerous, though few could articulate exactly why. Sheriff William Garrett, who held office from 1900 to 1908, maintained a personal journal discovered after his death in 1922. His entries from this period reveal a man torn between duty and pragmatism. He documented receiving multiple anonymous complaints about unnatural occurrences at the Ashton property. These complaints were vague, speaking of strange sounds, unusual activities at odd hours, and the suspicious disappearances of several individuals last seen heading toward the Ashton homestead. Garrett wrote that he felt he lacked legal grounds for a full investigation. "A man's property is his own business," he noted, "even if that business troubles the soul." In July 1904, responding to the persistent rumors, Garrett rode out to the Ashton property. He was received coldly but correctly by Dr. Ashton, who gave him a brief tour of the main house. The rooms were orderly, the furnishings expensive, the atmosphere merely clinical and remote rather than obviously sinister. Garrett requested to see the barn, where most rumors centered, but Dr. Ashton refused, stating it contained sensitive research materials and equipment that could be damaged by unauthorized entry. As a physician engaged in scientific study, he had rights to privacy that even the sheriff must respect. Garrett noted the Ashton children standing in a row as if arranged for inspection, silent as sentinels, their expressions blank. The youngest, Samuel, moved as if walking through water, slow and strange, his eyes unfocused. Garrett left with more questions than answers, but without evidence to justify further action. On the night of October 17th, 1906, the Ashton property burned. Multiple residents of Harlan County saw the glow against the sky from miles away, a orange-red luminescence that pulsed and grew through the darkness. By the time volunteers could organize and travel to the remote location, arriving at dawn, the barn had been completely destroyed, and the main house was a smoking ruin. No bodies were found in either structure, no signs of the family at all. A search of the surrounding woods discovered no tracks leading away, no indication of where the Ashtons might have fled, or if they had fled at all. The remains of the barn, once the fire had cooled enough for examination, revealed disturbing evidence. Scattered among the ashes and collapsed timbers were human bones, easily distinguished from animal remains by those with even basic knowledge of anatomy. These bones were mixed with fragments that appeared to be from livestock, but the human elements were undeniable. Volunteers searching through the debris discovered the melted remnants of dozens of specimen jars. Some still contained preserved tissue floating in evaporated fluid. Fragments of what appeared to be medical journals were found, their pages charred but with partial drawings visible, anatomical illustrations that were disturbingly inconsistent with normal human anatomy. The most horrifying discovery came when workers clearing debris from the barn's foundation uncovered evidence of a sophisticated underground chamber. The fire's heat had caused a partial collapse, revealing a space that extended 15 feet below the barn floor. Stone steps led downward into darkness. Sheriff Garrett, arriving later that morning, ordered lanterns brought and descended into this chamber. His official report described only finding evidence of storage. His private journal, discovered decades later, told a different story. The chamber contained stone tables with drainage channels carved into their surfaces, walls lined with shelves that had held numerous containers, and chains affixed to the walls at heights, suggesting they had been used to restrain human subjects. The space smelled of chemicals even after the fire, and the drainage channels led to a cistern that Garrett refused to have opened, fearing what might be found within. Sheriff Garrett's investigation in the days following the fire represented perhaps the only genuine attempt to document what had occurred at the Ashton property. He approached the task with thoroughness that his private writings suggest came from guilt over not acting sooner on his suspicions. Garrett catalogued everything found in the ruins. He collected bone fragments and had them examined by Dr. Harrison Mills from a neighboring county, who identified human remains from at least 7 different individuals of varying ages. Garrett preserved hair samples found in the underground chamber, gathered partial medical instruments that had survived the fire, and carefully packed remnants of the journals with their disturbing anatomical drawings. He took testimony from everyone who had helped search the ruins or who had any knowledge of the Ashton family. His official report, discovered sealed in an envelope in 1965, ran to 47 pages and documented evidence of prolonged criminal activity centered on unlawful medical experimentation. However, within 2 weeks of beginning his investigation, Garrett received a series of visits that would change everything. The county judge arrived first, speaking of the damage such revelations would do to Harlan County's reputation. A state legislator followed, emphasizing the economic implications if the region became known for housing a monster. Finally, a representative from the mining company that dominated the regional economy made the case most bluntly: justice for the dead, whose identities might never be confirmed and whose families might never be found, mattered less than prosperity for the living. The coal industry was bringing unprecedented growth to the area. Investment and migration would cease if Harlan became synonymous with horror. Garrett recorded in his journal that these men convinced him through a combination of practical arguments and implied pressure. They suggested his investigation file be sealed, pending further evidence that would likely never materialize. They spoke of the greater good and the need to move forward rather than dwelling on past tragedies. "God forgive me," Garrett wrote. I agreed. The systematic elimination of the Ashton family from official records began almost immediately after Sheriff Garrett agreed to suppress his investigation. Property deeds were located and altered to show the land had been vacant and unowned since 1900, with the improvements attributed to previous owners whose names appeared nowhere else in county records. Census documents from 1900 were modified, with the Ashton name removed and replaced with entries for families that had actually lived elsewhere, or that may never have existed at all. Birth and marriage certificates that might have mentioned the Ashtons, though few such documents existed in the first place, were systematically removed from files. The process was remarkably thorough, suggesting coordination at multiple levels of local government. When the county courthouse fire occurred in 1908, destroying significant portions of the archive, it provided convenient cover for the elimination of any remaining documents. Officials could claim that birth records, property transactions, and other papers mentioning the Ashtons had been lost to the fire, making verification impossible. Garrett's investigation file was ordered sealed under the pretense that it contained sensitive information related to ongoing inquiries. It then disappeared entirely, likely destroyed, though no record of its destruction was ever created. Local newspaper archives were edited with precision. The Harlan County Gazette and other regional papers had published occasional notices about the Ashtons during their residency, small mentions of property purchases, advertisements for Dr. Ashton's medical services, or social items about the family. These articles were carefully cut from bound volumes of newspapers stored in the library and courthouse. The excisions left rectangular holes in the pages, but without knowledge of what had been removed, future researchers would have no way of knowing what information was missing. The few families with significant direct knowledge of the Ashtons were approached individually through various means. Some received financial incentives to relocate or to simply remain silent. Others faced implied threats to their reputations or livelihoods if they continued to discuss the matter. Many were successfully convinced that speaking about the Ashtons harmed the community and served no useful purpose. The erasure of the Ashtons from official history was so successful that by 1910, the family's name existed only in private memories and documents held outside Harlan County. Children born after 1906 grew up never hearing the name Ashton. The property itself was eventually absorbed into adjacent holdings, with no marker or memory of what had stood there. This collective amnesia might have remained permanent, if not for Professor David Stern, a historian from the University of Kentucky, who stumbled upon fragmentary references to the Ashton affair while researching coal mining history in 1963. Stern was investigating patterns of migration and community development when he found letters and journals preserved in other states that mentioned the Ashtons and the mysterious events of 1906. Intrigued by the absence of any corresponding records in Harlan County itself, he traveled there and began interviewing elderly residents. His recordings and transcripts, deposited with the university archive, provide the most comprehensive oral history of the case. Ezekiel Thompson, 81 years old in 1963, recalled his father's work as a deputy under Sheriff Garrett. Thompson's father had been among those who searched the ruins and descended into the underground chamber. Thompson described his father's nightmares. He would wake, screaming about what they found in that underground chamber. He never gave specifics, only said that Dr. Ashton had been doing things to people, changing them, he said, trying to make them into something they weren't meant to be. Clara Hendricks, 78 in 1963, remembered her mother's absolute prohibition against speaking the Ashton name. Her mother had known Margaret Ashton and had pieced together from fragments of conversation and observation what was occurring. Mother said the doctor had been experimenting on people, Hendricks recalled, trying to prove some theory about improving the human body through surgery and other means she couldn't or wouldn't specify. She said they found evidence he had been making his own children help him, that they had been trained as assistants in his work. The interviews revealed a community that had maintained silence not from ignorance but from deliberate choice, a collective decision that some truths were better left unspoken. What happened to the Ashton family after the fire of October 1906 remains one of the enduring mysteries of the case. No confirmed sightings were ever recorded. No remains that could be definitively identified as belonging to the family were found in the ruins, though the intensity of the fire could have consumed bodies entirely. Three main theories emerged from the fragmentary evidence and testimony. The first suggests the family perished in the blaze, either accidentally trapped or deliberately remaining inside as the fire consumed their work. Some evidence supports this. The fire appeared to have been set in multiple locations simultaneously, suggesting intentionality rather than accident, and the underground chamber showed signs of recent use up until the night of the fire. The second theory proposes that the family fled before setting the fire themselves, destroying evidence of their activities before escaping to begin again elsewhere under new identities. The timing of the fire, occurring after dark when the family could slip away unnoticed, and the absence of any bodies or personal effects suggests premeditation. However, the isolated location and the thorough search of surrounding areas found no tracks or signs of departure. The most disturbing theory, supported by certain details recorded in private journals, suggests that Margaret Ashton, or possibly the children themselves, set the fire with Dr. Ashton inside, unable or unwilling to continue enabling his work. This theory gained unexpected support in 1968 when a letter surfaced, sent to a Louisville newspaper editor in 1924, but never published. The editor had preserved it among his personal papers, finding it too disturbing and unverifiable to print. The letter, allegedly written by someone claiming to be Nathaniel Ashton, provided a chilling account. My father believed he could perfect humanity through understanding and altering its physical form, it read. What began as medical research became obsession, then madness. He convinced himself the people who came to him, the desperate, the friendless, the forgotten, were willing subjects. By the end, he no longer cared about willingness. My mother knew but was too terrified to act. We children knew and did nothing, which makes us complicit in his sins. In 1974, a coal company purchased the land that had once been the Ashton property, planning to assess it for possible mining operations. During initial surveys, workers uncovered the remains of the foundation and the collapsed entrance to the underground chamber. The discovery prompted notification of authorities and eventually led to a formal archaeological excavation led by Dr. Elizabeth Warren from the University of Kentucky. Her team spent 3 months carefully documenting and recovering evidence from the site. The underground chamber measured approximately 30 feet by 40 feet, far larger than initial reports had suggested. It featured sophisticated ventilation and drainage systems and evidence of electrical wiring, which was highly unusual for rural Kentucky in 1906, when most homes still relied on lamps and candles. The excavation recovered human remains from at least 12 individuals in various states of preservation. Some had been buried in the earthen floor of the chamber, others found in the collapsed cistern where drainage channels led. Forensic analysis determined the remains represented men, women, and children, with ages ranging from approximately 7 years to middle age. Surgical tools of various types were recovered, including some of custom design that appeared to have been created specifically for procedures that had no legitimate medical purpose. Fragments of journals contained detailed notes about surgical procedures, theories about human enhancement through anatomical modification, and careful documentation of results. Dr. Warren's report describes evidence of attempted organ transplantation decades before such procedures became medically viable, bone restructuring experiments that showed sophisticated understanding of anatomy combined with complete disregard for human suffering, and procedures that appeared to be exploratory surgery conducted on living subjects. Several skeletons showed evidence of surviving multiple surgeries, with healed incisions indicating the individuals had lived for some time after being subjected to Dr. Ashton's experiments. The most disturbing finding came from a separate burial area where 3 small skeletons were found, children between ages 7 and 10. These remains showed evidence of procedures similar to those performed on adults, suggesting Dr. Ashton had experimented on children as well as adults, possibly including his own offspring or children specifically acquired for his research. The legacy of the Ashton case extends beyond the specific horrors discovered on that Kentucky property. It represents a broader pattern in American history, where communities chose collective amnesia over confronting uncomfortable truths. The systematic erasure nearly succeeded. Without the fragmentary evidence preserved in other states, the Henderson family's letters, the journals and private papers that escaped official purging, and the persistence of researchers like Professor Stern, the Ashtons would have been completely lost to history. The case raises disturbing questions about Dr. Ashton's motivations and capabilities. Modern analysis of his documented procedures suggests he possessed surgical knowledge decades ahead of his time. He understood principles of anatomy, preservation, and potentially transplantation that would not become common medical knowledge until mid-century. Whether he acquired this knowledge through conventional training and then perverted it, or whether his research on unwilling subjects itself advanced his understanding, remains unclear. The question of his family's complicity continues to haunt those who study the case. Were Margaret and the children willing participants in his work, terrified accomplices too frightened to resist or escape, or victims themselves, subjected to the same experimental procedures he inflicted on others? The letter, allegedly from Nathaniel, suggests complex dynamics of fear, conditioning, and normalized horror. Modern forensic analysis of remains recovered in 1974 confirmed all victims died between 1902 and 1906, the precise period of the Ashton family's residence. DNA analysis attempted in the 1990 seconds was largely unsuccessful due to degradation, but did confirm that at least 2 of the adult victims were related, possibly siblings, suggesting Dr. Ashton may have specifically targeted vulnerable individuals with few connections to report them missing. The Ashton property remains vacant today. Multiple attempts to develop the land have been abandoned. In 1989, a developer's construction crew refused to continue work after reporting unusual sounds from beneath the ground. One worker described hearing not screaming exactly, but something closer to the sounds of surgery, metal on bone, the scrape and tap of instruments. Some histories are deliberately forgotten, buried not in earth alone, but in the collective choice to look away. The Ashton name was erased from town records, but truth resists decay. The evidence remains beneath the Kentucky soil, waiting for those willing to uncover it.